Waiter insulted Melania Trump in a luxury restaurant. The owner's reaction leaves everyone stunned. It was a quiet evening at one of the most exclusive restaurants in New York City, where celebrities, high-profile figures, and the ultra-wealthy dined under soft, glimmering chandeliers. The restaurant, known for its luxurious atmosphere and five-star service, was a place where every guest was treated with the utmost respect and care. But on this particular night, something truly unexpected happened, a moment that would leave both staff and guests in shock. The evening was like any other at first. Guests were seated at their tables, sipping fine wine and enjoying the ambience. Among them was a woman who was no stranger to the limelight, Melania Trump. As the former First Lady of the United States, she was used to the attention. But tonight, she simply wanted to enjoy a peaceful, private meal with friends. She was dressed elegantly, radiating her usual poise and grace, blending in with the elite crowd of the restaurant. Everything seemed perfect until one of the waiters approached Melania's table. His demeanor was cold, his movements stiff. At first, no one paid much attention to him, thinking he was just another server doing his job. But then, without warning, his words sliced through the air like a knife. In a tone dripping with disdain, he insulted Melania, right there in front of everyone. The restaurant seemed to freeze in that moment. Guests at nearby tables glanced over, their eyes wide with disbelief. The staff exchanged nervous looks, unsure of what to do. How could this happen here, in a place where the service was supposed to be impeccable? And more importantly, how would Melania react? To her credit, Melania remained calm. Her face didn't betray any emotion, but the tension in the air was palpable. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Some guests whispered among themselves, speculating about whether the waiter would be fired on the spot or if Melania would make a scene. But she did neither. Instead, she sat there, composed, as if she was weighing her options. Meanwhile, the restaurant owner, a man known for his professionalism and commitment to perfection, had been watching the scene unfold from a distance. He could not believe what had just occurred in his establishment. This was a place where guests paid thousands of dollars for an experience, not just a meal, and now, that experience had been marred by one of his own employees. The owner knew he had to act fast, but how? How could he handle this delicate situation without causing an even bigger scandal? Should he apologize publicly? Should he ask the waiter to leave immediately? His mind raced with questions as he moved toward the table where Melania sat. As he approached, the restaurant fell eerily silent. All eyes were on him and the former First Lady. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. No one knew how this confrontation would end, but everyone knew it would be something they would never forget. Would the owner's decision restore the restaurant's reputation, or would this incident spiral out of control, leaving a lasting stain on the luxury dining experience? The answer would leave everyone stunned. And that's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Stay tuned to find out what happens next, because what unfolded in that moment is something no one saw coming. As the restaurant owner made his way toward Melania's table, a flurry of thoughts ran through his mind. He had built this establishment from the ground up, transforming it into a sanctuary for the elite, where discretion and service were paramount. A single slip-up could undo years of hard work, and here he was, facing a situation that could potentially ruin everything. The insult that had been hurled at Melania wasn't just offensive, it was deeply personal, and the ramifications could be disastrous. Guests whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting back and forth between the waiter, the owner, and Melania. The staff stood frozen, unsure of how to intervene or even if they should. This was uncharted territory for them. They were used to serving A-listers and high-profile figures, but never had they witnessed an incident like this. The tension continued to rise, and the entire restaurant seemed to hang in the balance of what would happen next. As the owner reached the table, he glanced at the waiter, who stood there defiantly, almost daring the owner to do something. The young man was relatively new to the restaurant, and while he had shown promise early on, something had clearly gone wrong tonight. His behavior was not just unprofessional, it was completely out of line. Yet there was something in his eyes, a simmering frustration that hinted at a deeper issue.
But now wasn't the time for that. The owner had to address the immediate crisis. He turned to Melania, who still sat calmly, her eyes fixed on him, waiting to see how he would handle the situation. The owner knew that his next words could either diffuse the tension or escalate it further. In a voice filled with sincerity, he offered a heartfelt apology. He assured Melania that the waiter's actions did not reflect the values of the restaurant, and that steps would be taken to address the matter immediately. His words were carefully chosen, not just to appease Melania, but to show the rest of the guests that he was in control, that this moment would not define the restaurant. Melania listened quietly, her expression unreadable. She nodded slightly, acknowledging the apology, but offering no indication of whether she was satisfied. For a moment, it seemed like the situation might be resolved smoothly. But then, just as the owner was about to turn to the waiter, something unexpected happened. The waiter, who had remained silent up until this point, suddenly spoke up. His voice was filled with frustration, and he addressed the entire room, not just the owner. He talked about the pressure of working in such an elite environment, the constant demands from guests, and the feeling of being invisible, even as he catered to their every need. His words were raw and unfiltered, exposing the stress that many in the service industry feel but rarely express. He didn't excuse his behavior, but he seemed to be pleading for someone to understand the weight he carried. The room, which had been filled with tension just moments before, now shifted to an uncomfortable silence. No one knew how to respond. Some guests slipped down, embarrassed by the waiter's words, while others seemed to sympathize, nodding slightly as they listened. For the owner, this was an even more delicate situation. He could see that the waiter was struggling, but at the same time, his outburst had crossed a line. The restaurant was a place of luxury and exclusivity, and guests came here expecting perfection, not personal confessions. Yet the owner couldn't deny the humanity in the waiter's words. This wasn't just about an insult to Melania anymore. It had become something bigger, a moment where the invisible line between service and status was being exposed for all to see. As the tension mounted, Melania, who had remained composed throughout, finally spoke. Her voice was soft but steady, cutting through the room like a calm breeze. She addressed the waiter directly, acknowledging the difficulty of his job and the challenges that come with serving in such a high-pressure environment. But then she gently reminded him that regardless of the stress he was under, respect and kindness were non-negotiable, especially in a place where people were simply trying to enjoy a meal. Her words, though kind, carried a firmness that left no room for debate. The waiter's expression shifted, the defiance draining from his face as he realized the gravity of his actions. It was clear that, in that moment, he understood the impact of his words, not just on Melania, but on the entire restaurant. The owner, sensing the opportunity to bring the situation to a close, stepped forward again. He thanked Melania for her understanding and reassured her that the matter would be handled appropriately. But just as it seemed the tension was beginning to ease, another guest, someone who had been quietly observing from the corner, stood up and began to speak. This guest, an older gentleman with a stern expression, criticized the entire situation, blaming the owner for allowing such an incident to occur in the first place. His words were sharp, accusing the restaurant of losing its standards and letting unqualified staff ruin the dining experience. His voice rose, and soon, other guests began to murmur in agreement. What had started as a private moment between the waiter and Melania had now escalated into a larger conversation about the state of the restaurant itself. The owner, now caught between calming the disgruntled guests and addressing the deeper issues raised by the waiter, found himself in a difficult position. The stakes had never been higher, and as the tension in the room reached its peak, Everyone waited to see how the situation would resolve. What happens next? How will the owner navigate this storm and protect the reputation of his restaurant? Stay tuned for the final part of this story, where the resolution will leave you absolutely speechless. The older gentleman's words hung in the air, casting a heavy shadow over the once luxurious dining room. Guests who had been hesitant to speak now found their voices, murmuring in agreement. Some nodded toward the man who had spoken up, their dissatisfaction bubbling to the surface. For the restaurant owner, this was his worst nightmare. The elegant atmosphere he had worked so hard to maintain was unraveling before his eyes, all because of one ill-timed comment from a waiter. The owner knew he had to act swiftly. He could feel the tension rising, and if he didn't do something soon, the entire evening would spiral out of control. He glanced at Melania, who remained calm, a pillar of composure amidst the growing chaos. She hadn't asked for this scene, but she was at the center of it, and the owner felt the pressure to resolve the situation not just for her, but for every guest in the room. The waiter, visibly shaken now, had lost the defiant edge he once held. His earlier outburst had ignited something he hadn't anticipated, a broader criticism of the restaurant itself. The weight of his words seemed to crash down on him all at once, and he stood silently, unsure of what to do next. He looked around the room, seeing the disapproving glances from the guests, and it became clear that this was no longer just about his personal frustrations. But then, just when the tension seemed unbearable, something unexpected happened. Melania stood up. The entire room went silent, every eye now fixed on her. She addressed the older gentleman first, her voice calm but firm. She acknowledged his concerns, but then she said something that surprised everyone. She praised the restaurant for its years of exceptional service, for creating a space where guests felt special and cared for. She didn't excuse the waiter's actions, but she made it clear that one mistake didn't erase all the hard work the owner and staff had put into making the restaurant what it was. Her words had a calming effect on the room. The murmurs of discontent began to die down, and guests listened intently. Melania then turned to the waiter, her gaze soft but steady. She told him that while his job was undoubtedly challenging, his role was important. His interactions with guests could make or break their entire experience. She reminded him that respect goes both ways, and that how he handled difficult situations defined his character, not just as a waiter, but as a person. The waiter, humbled by her words, nodded in agreement. It was clear that he had made a mistake, and the gravity of the situation was not lost on him. He apologized not just to Melania, but to the entire room, acknowledging that his frustrations had gotten the better of him and that his actions had been unprofessional. His sincerity seemed to resonate with the guests, who softened their gazes, understanding that everyone, no matter their position, faces challenges. The owner, seeing that the situation had diffused, stepped forward. He thanked Melania for her grace and understanding, and he apologized once again to the entire room, promising that the incident would be handled with care and that steps would be taken to ensure something like this never happened again. He then announced that the evening's meals would be on the house as a gesture of goodwill, hoping to restore the restaurant's reputation and show his commitment to his guests. Slowly, the tension in the room began to lift. The guests, now reassured, resumed their conversations, albeit in a more subdued manner. The older gentleman who had spoken out nodded in approval, seemingly satisfied with how the situation had been handled. The waiter, visibly relieved but still shaken, was quietly escorted to the back, where the owner assured him that while there would be consequences, this could also be a moment of learning and growth. As the evening wore on, the restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The clinking of glasses and the soft murmur of conversation filled the air once more. Melania, having diffused the situation with grace, continued her meal, unbothered by the earlier commotion. She had handled the moment with a kind of quiet strength that many admired, showing that even in the face of disrespect, there was always room for kindness and understanding. By the end of the night, the restaurant owner reflected on what had happened. It had been a challenging evening, one that could have easily destroyed his establishment's reputation. But thanks to Melania's calm intervention, the situation had not only been salvaged, but it had also served as a reminder to everyone about the importance of respect, understanding, and the human experience. As the guests filtered out of the restaurant, many paused to thank the owner for how he had handled the evening. Some even offered kind words to the staff, recognizing that behind the luxury and glamour, there were real people working hard to make the experience special. In the end, the incident became a story of redemption, not just for the waiter, but for the restaurant itself. It was a reminder that no place is perfect, and no person is without fault, but how we handle our mistakes can define who we are. For the guests who had witnessed the night's events, it was a story they would tell for years to come. A moment that reminded them that even in the most unexpected places, grace and humility could prevail. And so the night ended not in scandal or disaster, but in quiet reflection, with everyone leaving the restaurant having learned something valuable about themselves and others. It was a night that none of them would soon forget.